forward, we now have actually a version of Angular that's shipped. It's the 1.0 release that's out, actually 1.06. The Angular website is the place to go for information, obviously. What's nice about the Angular website, the examples are live, and we'll kick into some of those examples here. They have a tutorial. It's called PhoneCat. Lets you do a catalog of different cell phones and so forth. That's actually a good tutorial to work through. And my go-to sources on the website, there's a developer guide and API reference. And so if we look at Angular, you know, the website, fairly straightforward website. What I was saying, the couple places that I go for information, the developer guide is definitely one that comes up with a lot of information there. The API reference also, and we'll dive into more of these. The tutorial is here also, so it has you download and you can work through it. But definitely, one of the nice things about this is the fact that it's live. So the hello world example, it's here, and we can see it live. So now let's. I think my next slide is digging into. Yep. All right. Let's talk about and. Which, by the way, we're going to dive into code now. Any questions up till now, or?
Can you put a link to this PDF again?
The link to the PDF.
Just post it to the event.
I'm taking notes.
Yeah,
I'm going to post to everyone later.
Just post the link to the event.
Yeah, we'll post it.
Post the link to the event right now, that anybody who's using
right
the device can just go there and click it.
So if he wants it right now, I think so. It's golddesigns.com.
Let's see, what page am I on? I am on 22. Okay. So there's the. Now, unfortunately, it's because I've clicked on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Got it?
Yep.
Okay. Let's see if I can get back to 22.
Can you post? You can comment.
Okay.
How likely Angular is to conflict with jQuery? If you are using Angular and jQuery both, because Angular is not fully implemented framework yet. It's
Actually,
still
I have
in
a slide on
development.
that. You load jQuery first.
Okay.
But okay, so yeah, we'll talk about that. All right. So at this point, I did show you a quick Angular example, and I just want to point out what are the kind of three main things that we did in that piece of code that make it an Angular app. First and foremost, the Angular is a library. It's a JavaScript library. So we load it. In this case, I'm loading it from a content delivery network that Google provides. And so that's the code that gets everything up and running. Now, when that's loaded, one of the things it does is it puts a handler on the document ready event. And when it gets that document ready, that's when it has the chance to go through and begin its compile step. And the first thing it looks for, one of the things it looks for, is it's looking for something that says compile this app. So by default, just including the AngularJS source into your, JavaScript into your application does not make Angular itself run. You have to somehow tell it you want it to run. So this is where they're giving you the option, kind of the library versus framework. If you want to treat this as a library, you can choose what parts you're going to bring up. But the easiest thing to do is just to put this declaration on your HTML tag, ng-app. And putting ng-app is now telling Angular, I want everything to be an Angular app. You can also restrict it if you want to just divs or smaller parts of your code. So there's ways, and I'll show you some ideas on like ways you can just bring in Angular to some of your partial partial documents and so forth. So, but after that, you're now starting to use the Angular markup.
So does it cause code flash on slower machines then?
Shouldn't. Well, okay. Yeah. What
Document ready happens.
if there's ways that you hide it, and actually I wasn't going to get into that. It's kind of more of an advanced, but you can specify something as ng hide, and what it does is the style sheet has it marked as hidden by default, and then you bring things displayed when you want it, when things are ready. So there's ways to try to manage that flash. And you know, I don't think it's really an issue of, do you have it, you might just have it more on a slower machine than you would on any other machine. So if you're having a flash, you manage that. So
I've simulated in the iOS simulator low memory when I'm working on an Angular project, and it seems like it delays display of the DOM until it's processed it. I haven't ever seen it show like the brackets and stuff before rendering.
okay, yeah, they're trying to be a good citizen and not display too much. Sometimes it depends also on whether you're loading templates, and we'll talk more about templates that get loaded, because you can sometimes see things build up, or if you have asynchronous requests going to the server, you can have delays waiting for that. So there's all sorts of things, but there's also ways you handle those delays in Angular. So
I found the easiest way to prevent the flash of unrendered content is you can use an attribute called ngBind, which it essentially does the same thing as using those curly braces. If it's wrapped in a div element, if you do ngBind your name, it'll take the content and place it inside the tag.
oh, okay.
And then another attribute is ngCloak, which hides those curly braces until it's done rendering.
Yeah. Actually, and something I don't have a slide on, the two curly braces, this is a mustache style markup, which mustache is one of the templating languages that's out there. What Angular does with those curly braces, it uses a process they call interpolation, which they look for certain characters within your text, and if they match the pattern that you're looking for, they translate it into Angular markup, and that's the ngBind. So really, the fact that you have these braces, the reason the ngBind would work is, you know, the your name with two braces around it is actually text content that Angular substitutes. If you instead put a span in there with an ngBind, that's effectively what this will become, and you wouldn't, that's a good point, you probably wouldn't see the flash from this because a span is just empty at that point. So, we definitely jumped into some stuff we'll get more into, but yeah, the interpolation is another process that Angular is using to recognize what should be translated. It's all this HTML compiling. There's also other ways to manage what's getting loaded, and I'll talk a little about that. How am I doing on time? Oh, okay. So this once again, I mean, I can pull up the app again if, you know, that the example again, but these were the 4 key points that turned it into an Angular app. So now, one of the terms that we get into when we start talking about Angular is the concept of a scope. And the scope, next slide I'll show you the relationship to what a model is, but basically the scope is what the view is able to use to access its model. You do get, you can create scopes on your own, but actually I don't know if I ever have, because Angular automatically creates one of these scopes with a controller, and so when you're binding your view to your controller, you get your scope, and it's really kind of what you want to have happen. So I have not actually created a scope, but I use them all the time. The scope, it does have a hierarchy. There's prototypical inheritance. Next slide will show that. There's a root scope, and there's a concept of isolated scopes. Unless you want to get into that, we'll skip that. But the basically, this image is showing kind of the relationship between a scope and the model, and effectively, I think of them as being the same. I guess I don't. This was a image from the Angular documentation. I think if you click on it, it'll take you to the page that this was on. But the concept of a scope is a JavaScript object, and it has, the object then has, what do I want to say? Not pointers, but yeah, there we go. References to whatever you consider in the model. And when we look at some controller code, you'll see that you make these assignments. Whatever you want, like this person reference is referencing another object that has a first name and a last name in it. So you're defining what relationships you want to have in the scope, and that's something that you're doing in the controller. And another image from the Angular documentation, it's showing the nesting of these scopes. So the importance of nesting of scopes is as we build an app. So for example, at the app class, so the HTML level, you do get a scope. It's called the root scope. So that's everything then can inherit from, prototypically inherit from the root scope. And you can see here's a scope that has some bindings for the greeting, and they're able to specify that through this controller. They're saying that the ng controller goes to something they call the greeting controller, which has defined a scope. And here's another scope created with the list controller. And we'll come back to something called repeats, but there's even, when you start having repeating blocks in there, Angular's creating scopes for you automatically, but they inherit from the parent scope. So not only do you have access to whatever data you have at the scope that's created, it can have access to the parent's information also. And we'll come back to that when we look at repeat. I think repeat is really cool. So the scopes, basically, like I said, I always think of scopes as being the model. That's where your data is. So that's one of the magic pieces of Angular. Another piece of magic is what they refer to as two-way data binding. And this really is an extremely powerful concept, and also very important from a software engineering standpoint. It's always good to have a single source of truth. And what that means, what Angular is doing is they have a mechanism in their in the framework that is always keeping the view and the model synced. So a change in the view will get propagated to the model, and a change in the model will get propagated to the view. And they refer to this process as the digest cycle. So there's a lot to read on it. I don't want, I'm not going to go too much into it, because just to know that it's happening. But it's all part of this declarative relationships. If you remember on our Hello World example, we had the name. Anytime something changed in the user interface, then Angular took care of actually updating that value in the scope. And I didn't show a scope on that one. It defaulted to the root scope. But there was a scope there that had a value being updated of name. And then the fact that we had connected the name in the display to that same variable, it was getting refreshed. And that's part of this digest cycle. The digest cycle is going through and doing watches and saying, if this changes, I know something I need to do. And the nice thing is, you can display a value numerous places, and it'll update them all. You don't have to worry about, oh, I need to link this one and link this one and make sure I don't break the link that went to this other one. You just declaratively specify, I want all these to display that value, and it'll keep them all up to date, and it takes care of all the linking for you behind the scenes, all the binding. So. There's also, okay, the controller, this is the rest, kind of the rest of the code. This is where you've got the code behind what's happening. So you've got a view that's displaying, you've got your data in your model, and then there's this controller. And so think of the controller kind of as almost everything else. But there's a lot more to that because we want to do some structure on that. We'll come back to that. So this is just showing some ideas where you see the relationships. So in the view, you've specified like the name, and it then is linking it into the scope, which has the value of the name. And anytime anything changes, it's doing the updates, and the scope is getting injected into the controller so that you have access to it, and the controller now can change those values. The controller changes the value for name. Angular takes care of updating the view. So
you had kind of sold this as a declarative syntax, obviously on the view level, which is fantastic.
okay.
One of my issues with Backbone is that synchronization process. But then you come into here and you're showing in your controller an imperative behavior. So in your slide you had a jQuery example where you had to imperatively define everything, and you're doing the same thing in the scope or in the controller there.
Well, there's times that you may want to change it. I mean, that's anytime you have code, you're changing your values, and this is imperative code. I mean, we are doing some sort of processing underneath. So,
Okay, so that's our responsibility as developers, not
correct,
Angular?
correct.
Okay.
Angular's, what's happening here with this, and he's pointing at this piece of code right here with the controller. The scope.name equals world. Okay, if you execute that line, it is going to change the value of world in the scope. But that's all you do in your code. Angular then propagates that change to whoever else is watching that value. So it's kind of magic. You just kind of trust that Angular's doing it. But yes, imperative coding, that is what we're ultimately doing kind of under the covers here. So. Yeah.
For my understanding, scope is nothing but a namespace, right? So that there is no conflict if you have same function name used across multiple places, but you have defined namespaces, so there is no chance of you inadvertently executing multiple functions that you didn't intend to.
It will execute the closest one. That goes back, if I go back to the page, there is a hierarchy of scopes.
Right.
So there is scope nesting that's happening. So if you override the name in a child scope, it will use whatever one is closest.
Okay.
And it's prototypical inheritance. So in JavaScript, if it doesn't, when you try to access a variable or a function, it'll go up the prototype chain trying to find the name, and the first one it finds is what it'll use. One thing to be aware of, if you, and I don't have a slide for this, but if you try to, from a view, if you update a value and it doesn't exist, it creates it in the scope. So if we in our view would were to say address equals, or just put an input field there for address or email address or whatever, it'll create that in your scope. So now you have a new variable there. So it takes care of automatic creation. So we really, like the name, we didn't really have to declare anything unless we want to do processing on it. Then we just reference it as another variable. But there is something to be aware of. A write to a primitive object will always happen at the most recent scope, unless, or the top levels, or your scope that you're closest, that you're in, I guess. Otherwise, you need an object reference to get to a primitive value, to be able to write to a primitive value in a higher scope. I'm not doing a good job of explaining, but there's things, good things to be aware of, that, like name, if name actually was just a string and it was in one of the parent scopes, writing to it would actually create a new one if it's a primitive, versus if it's an object, you're okay. An object, name dot first name, it would get to it as the primitive. I'm not doing a good job of explaining. It's something that you'll wonder sometime, why isn't this working at the level I think? And it's
Acts as a string literal, for instance, by reference in JavaScript.
yeah, I mean it's JavaScript. Ultimately, it's something that happens in JavaScript. It's kind of one of these things that the first time you hit it in Angular, you're kind of like, huh, why didn't that work the way I expected? And it's just the way JavaScript handles primitive references versus object references. Object references, it'll find it because then it's a primitive in the object. And I know I'm totally waving my hands here. This would be a great slide. But you know, a primitive reference, just it can only write in the local scope. But if you read it, it'll read it wherever it finds it. So, all right, total confusion there. So, actually, just as far as we've gone now with Angular, just introducing scopes and controllers and firing it up, there's actually a lot you can do with bringing Angular into a application at this point. So this is, I'm going to, let's see, yep, I can pull up the site here. This is a WordPress site that we had done. It's custom theme with page templates, and this was actually one of my first Angular pieces of code I wrote. So the order form, let me see if I can, excuse me here. All right. It's not.
Control.
Oh, there's the old one. Okay. Now, by the way, if you do go to this is a live site. So you know, if you put an order in, you can order wine, but it's good wine too. The nice thing about, you know, this is where Angular is keeping things up to date. You know, as you notice as I change values here, it's updating across and adding. You know, this was all just declarative relationships that I defined behind the scene, and it wants a shipping state to be able to know where it's shipping it to. So. Where's Minnesota? There we go. So, oh, and it only ships in, yep, so I can't order just two. Oh, here I go. Can't order two of those. So this is just Angular keeping things live. It's all part of just defining the relationships. There's a controller behind this. One of the things I did was this, my first attempt at Angular. It's a big controller, and it's got all the code in one controller. Actually, I would love to rewrite this and break it up and modularize it, because controllers are actually better if they're small and they reference services, which we'll talk to. But this is just giving an idea of, Angular, and this was basically a single screen. So this was just injecting Angular into a single page just to take advantage of the functionality, not building the entire website in Angular. So it's something that you can start to just iterate pieces of your system into Angular on this. And let's see, there's another page, the product location, that one was kind of fun too.
So you can use AngularJS with other libraries, fine?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like treating it like a library at that point. So this, I did, when I fired this up, it's just limited to the part that I told it to augment. So WordPress is around this, PHP code and all that stuff is happening, but the Angular is just inside of this. I introduced it as a short code so that as you can actually type into the page text around it, and then like the order form or this location page is something that you tell it where you want in the WordPress site. So I mean, that's just something you do in WordPress, but bringing it into an existing app or existing web is pretty straightforward.
Before you had mentioned that you need to load jQuery first if you're going to use them together. So if I was bringing in like Modernizer or other things like that, would I load those first as well? Or?
I think the only one that I'm aware of that has a dependency is jQuery.
Okay.
And all right, since that's come up, I do have a slide later, but the reason that there is a dependency on jQuery is Angular does have an implementation that of a jQuery Lite, because they need some of the capabilities or similar capabilities to what jQuery offers in terms of finding things in the DOM. So they implemented the bare necessities of what they needed, and therefore you can get by without loading jQuery and Angular runs fine. But if you want to bring in jQuery, bring it in first, and then they use the jQuery that's loaded instead of their light version. So, and that's the only requirement that I'm aware of. As far as I know, Modernizer can be loaded at any point. So,
I was curious. So say you had a page version and you wanted to have like default values on it before you had them replaced and updated with Angular. How would you go about handling that?
so when you say,
So like you had like your cart page, say, and then like you had your cart totals changing. Say they already had like a previous session and they had 2 items and it was $18, and then you wanted to change it so that they said 3 items are now $36 or something, right? So how would you render like say the $18 on a calculated column on page load, say, and then change it, or in your name example, have a default name, hello John, and then they start typing that changes to something else.
Yep. That's where in your controller you can specify what you want the value to be initialized to. Now actually in the order form, I do use cookies to store, if you've had a previous order and you've closed the page, you open it again, it'll have the value there. So I store anything that's updated in a cookie, restore it upon coming back in. So if the price, and I only store in that case the quantity, so if the price had changed, it would get the new price when you open it again.
The other option you have is use JSON and reference JSON objects from within Angular. I was recently talking to somebody who had a similar example performed, where you had to hit update button after doing everything, and they wanted to get away from it. So they had developers writing jQuery code, and they wrote about 390 some lines of jQuery code to achieve that, but they were having bugs in there. So they kept going through it for 2 months. And somebody came in, an outside consultant, and looked at it and said, how about if we use AngularJS? And they literally discarded 390 lines of jQuery code, and pretty much this binding took care of what they needed. So it's very powerful actually.
Yeah. So By the way, am I okay? Good on time?
How much,
So,
we have one demo. How is everybody doing on time? Can we go until 9? I have 8:45 in the agenda. Are you okay with 9?
Then working.
Yeah, okay. So we end at 9 instead of 8:45 is what,
and the.
so that will give 20 more minutes and
And
then
the demo needs
then
15 minutes, is that?
Whatever.
Whatever, okay,
Okay.
all right, all right.
All right, midnight.
Yeah. So, all right. So, yeah, this example, one thing I was also going to show on this